Let me start off with a little bit about myself and my perspective in this presentation. First of all, it's important for you to know that I really am a civilian. I have not had military service in the Vietnam era, but I never was in the military. People often believe that my interest stems from actually having been a service member, but that actually isn't true. So my father and grandfather and uncle, just about every other male in my family is a service member, was a service member. I was a student. And so I'm going to be talking to you from the perspective of a civilian. And those of you who are service members in the audience, feel free to add as I'm going along, because I'm really talking about my experiences from the point of view of a civilian. My work with veterans and service members really was confined primarily to a 5-year period when I worked at the Raleigh Vet Center. At the Vet Center, I went there originally just to see if the Vet Center would be a good site, placement site for our students in counselor ed. And once I was there, I thought we could work in some collaborative projects, and the whole thing grew, and I became a staff member, a volunteer staff member, because vet centers are traditionally very small and woefully underfunded. And so our program was able to really help out by bringing interns and practicum students and also staff members, me, to help the center out. My work there involved groups. I never did individual therapy. I never had an individual caseload. I did educational groups, open groups, closed groups, and I was also involved in an annual exposure therapy kind of intervention when we took the veterans to Washington, D.C., because we could. And we would have a tour of the wall and then a day-long debriefing after that. And that seemed to be very helpful for them, and they seemed to be very appreciative of it. But that's where my work with veterans came from. Most of the things I'll be telling you or talking about really came from what the veterans told me, what I learned through observation, and the kinds of things in the literature that make sense to me based on my own experiences there. Right now, my clinical work is pretty much supervision. I don't have a caseload. I don't see people anymore. I do see people who are clients but don't recognize it. But my work is really restricted now to a much more academic work as a clinical supervisor. I like to think about myself as a veterans advocate also. And one of my personal goals, my personal mission has been to recruit more veterans into the DARPA program and help them finish their degrees. In the last 10 years, I've gotten 3 through, so at least I've gotten something for my mission. That's my big goal. Because we do need that type of person to really put leadership in the field of counselor education. And again, as I'm going along, stop me at any time. If I say something that doesn't make sense or isn't clear. Point of view of this presentation is, first of all, that the military is a distinct culture from civilian culture. It has its own language. People have their own style of dress, their own ceremony, so forth and so on. And civilians are seen as outsiders by service members, and that actually is true. Even though everybody in the military was a civilian at one point, the military does change people, and they become very similar, even the different branches. Civilians are often viewed with suspicion. It's just because civilians are outsiders and their motives are not clear. And in a lot of ways, civilians really are different in a military mindset from other service members. So it's hard to know what civilians are up to or what they're going to do next. But I absolutely believe that civilian therapists can be very effective. And I don't want any of you to be deterred or feel like somehow you can't do this work because you're not a service member or because you don't have a war zone experience. I'm glad that most of you don't have a war zone experience, because it's not a good thing to have. It will give you great understanding, but it can also give you nightmares and terrible life experiences after that. So let me go on and talk about military culture. These are the two big issues that we'll be talking about. This whole notion of mission is extremely important when you're talking about the military. It's more than just operations that are carried out. It's a point of view, a way of organizing life, and organizing one's purpose. And it's an essential kind of concept to have when you are working with service members, for you to understand how important the mission is, and how often that term and that organized way of thinking will occur. Today I'm going to focus just on military values, virtues, and precepts. This isn't all that there is of military culture, but this is as much as I'm going to try to cover today in the time I have allotted. But before I go further, I need to ask you, is this information going to be brand new to you? Is this something you've heard before? Is this something that's, that you're looking for more specific kinds of thoughts about? Just by show of hands, who is brand new to this? Okay. So most of you are not new. All right. So again, feel free to jump in, ask questions, or ask for clarification as I move on. This chart just shows you what the core values are of each of the service branches. This is what you would find if you looked at the websites for each one of the branches. The Army has the longest list. But just because everyone doesn't have honor or everyone doesn't have loyalty doesn't mean that those aren't important values at all. Because they do show up in other places. For example, the Air Force definition of integrity has 13 elements in it. And it includes everything from courage to respect, autonomy, all sorts of things are in there. So just because you see this list this way doesn't mean that that's all there is to each one of them. If you just take a look at the Army list again, these are some short definitions that are taken from the website that will give you a sense of what it means, what these types of things actually mean. But the core moral traits are the elements that are found in all of the service branches. These are the ones that really are often the source of conflicts, the source of pain, and the source of shame and guilt for veterans. Courage, as you would guess, is absolutely essential. And if a veteran or an active duty service member feels that he or she has lacked courage or not demonstrated courage in an important situation, it's not something that can just easily be forgiven to the self. And that's one big difference between service members and civilians. Service members are very invested in their values and very serious about their values, and extremely upset if they see that they have value violations. It's not light, it's not easy, it's not simple, it's very serious. So all of these traits, all of these issues are particularly important to veterans, service members as well, active duty. Discipline, of course, you would expect. Self-control is extremely important, and that also means self-regulation. Never being out of control, never being out of shape, never being unfit. And so the whole idea of being disabled at any time for any reason is very unsettling for veterans, and something that they really do not wish to identify with ever. Okay. The Soldier's Creed is a document that I first saw when I was at the Vet Center. And a good thing about this is I think it sums up, in one fairly short piece, how values and the core moral traits all fit together for service members. Even though this is for soldiers, I think it applies also to Marines, Coast Guard members, airmen, so forth and so on. This one statement really does say a lot. It just sums up how all of these things fit together, in my mind, for veterans and active duty service people. What's the question so far? All right, there are three other military virtues that are also very important, and these are things that I never would have guessed about the military. One of the things I found out that was always extremely interesting to me is that the veterans that I met and the service members, the active duty people that I have also met, think about themselves as peacekeepers. They don't actually think about themselves as warriors. I mean, they take on that title, but they think that they are peacekeepers and helpers. I was really surprised how much the veterans were invested in trying to help the students that actually came from our program. They saw themselves as providing a service to the students. They look for ways to help other people. And so this whole notion of restoring the peace, keeping the peace, is very important in the military person's mind. By the same token, they do understand the use of force, but that comes also with this virtue of restraint. That should be the last thing that you do. The first way you engage the other is not to kill the other, but to try to negotiate, try to settle things out. But at sometimes deadly force is necessary and deadly force is used. But the whole notion of restraint is built into how service members view their use of force. That's the last thing I really want to do, but I am very prepared to do it. And this last virtue is obedience. And that doesn't just mean simple-minded, doing whatever people tell you. It means following the chain of command, following orders. It also means giving moral orders, giving orders that make sense, that are driven by virtues as well. It means everybody participating in a system that protects everyone else by everyone believing the same thing and moving in the same direction. So obedience is very much a part also of how service members think, and it's played out mostly though in a chain of command. These codified regulations are the embodiment in a legal format of the values and morals that service members have. I won't go through all of these in any great detail, but these five pretty much cover how the military is organized legally within itself. And all of these precepts are, if you were to read through them, you would see how the values flow from them again. All the values are inherent within each one. The just war doctrine is one that's not very familiar to most people, but again, you can see right away that it starts with restraint. War should be the last resort of the last type of military action. And the war should be for a just cause, benefits should outweigh the cost, and the use of force should never be limited to or motivated by hate or revenge. So service members believe that this is what constitutes a reason to have a war, to go to war, or to be involved in a military action that involves killing. There is this whole just war doctrine is how service members are trained. Yes.
I have a question. The war must be authorized. Who authorizes it?
Congress authorizes the war. Strictly speaking, that's who's supposed to authorize the war. However, in real life, what actually happens is wars are not authorized. And that is a major source of difficulty and conflict for service members. Every war isn't. Some are and some are not. You have a question?
Well, I think, you know, when Congress pays for it, that's a de facto authorization. But the formal declaration of war, we haven't had that since, you know, World War II. We've had, as everybody knows, several wars, conflict since then, and Congress authorizes the money, it's a de facto authorization.
Okay. Rules of engagement are just that. It's the rules for how a military operation is going to be carried out. And for our service members, this is often a source of both pride and frustration. It's a source of pride because it means that all of the values and precepts are put together in such a way that whatever operation takes place is done as cleanly and neatly and with a little destruction as possible, as much as necessary. But it's also a source of frustration because if the enemy knows that you have certain rules of engagement, they don't have to have rules of engagement. So they can act in ways that prevent you from acting in an honorable manner. They can act like hiding in a civilian area and then firing out to shoot you, knowing you can't shoot back or you shouldn't shoot back. Engaging in acts of terrorism, using human shields, all sorts of things that you've heard about or known about actually do occur. And service members die because they cannot engage the enemy in a way that is a response to what's happening to them. So they are a source of pride and frustration, and it's one of the things that typically has often come up. I have often heard people talk about it in therapy, when they could not go a certain place or they could not stop who they knew was actually causing trouble, when they could not do what needed to be done to solve the situation because of the rules of engagement. And the rules of engagement change, and they're very fluid. And the part that makes it very difficult for the person in the war zone is that the rules of engagement may come from stateside, but you're actually there, and sometimes they don't make sense by the time they get to you, or the situation has changed. So it's a very complicated process that causes a great deal of frustration. I've tried to reduce the differences that exist between the civilian culture and military culture to this tiny list. Of course, there are a lot more differences than this, but I think this is a way of helping you get started to see what happens here. These ideas are ideas I got from working with veterans at the Vet Center who were not only Vietnam vets, but some were World War II, a few Korean, and a few Gulf War vets, but not that many. I don't think the Gulf War vets liked me that much. For some reason, they just didn't want to talk to me, but the other vets were fine. So there's a big, and again, I think you can see how this might be true, that civilian culture does have an emphasis on individuality, individual achievement, personal freedom, and fluid social relationships. The military culture does emphasize the unit. And unit cohesion is extremely important. And that was one advantage I had of being a group therapist. The vets like to be in groups. They like to work together as a team. They thought about things as a unit. And one of the reasons that civilians are seen as outsiders is because they're not part of any unit. You're not part of the group. We're not part of the group. There's a great emphasis on the mission. The mission is first and foremost. It's paramount in the thinking of service members. What is my mission? How do I get it done? What's the fastest and most efficient way to get things done? Devotion to duties is essential, and chain of command is how everything works. So these differences in military culture also account for veterans' thoughts about civilians Let me go back. I'll leave that one right there. I'm going to get to some stereotypes that veterans have about civilians and about civilian therapists, but they come from these differences that I just showed you. All right, these three themes here really describe, I guess in a theoretical sense, why there's tension between the military and service members, between the military culture and civilian culture. This customer service provider relationship means that the military is really a service provider for the civilian population. But the service that they provide is one that uses deadly force, and no one wants to see them do it. Everyone wants the military to do their job, but no one wants to know what the job is, how you do it, or where you do it. And no one wants to know about people getting killed or being wounded. And so what that does is creates a resentment on the side of the service provider. This other issue, civilian ambivalence regarding military power. While the military is obviously very powerful, civilians on the one hand want that strong arm to be able to crush their own enemies, but they also don't want that arm to turn on them. And since the military is not only very well organized, but very well armed, there's always a sense of threat hovering about that the military may decide to take over because they can do things better, faster, and more efficiently. And you can see throughout the world this often does happen, that the military actually does take over the government for any number of reasons. And even though this fear is not voiced openly, it's one of the underlying currents that creates tensions between military officials and civilian officials. And this last, again, principle, the military principle of unit cohesion, has service members always believing that they know more about themselves than civilians, that they can help themselves better than civilians, that they are better organized, better functioning than civilians, and they really don't want to be intruded upon by civilians. Is this making sense?
Yes.
Okay. These were three things that I heard over and over at the Vet Center. The first one was that civilians really don't care. And for the Vietnam veterans, that was particularly true, that they really didn't want to hear what service members had to say. I'm glad to say this is not nearly as bad as it used to be, because I think American population in particular is learned a lot from the Vietnam veteran experience and has done a much better job of trying to embrace the veterans when they return home, and having a much better and deeper respect for active duty personnel, though everyone is not pro-military or even positive military. And that was a thing that was actually hard for me to think about, because I am from North Carolina, you know, it's a pro-military state. But there are actually people, and some people have told me this recently, who really don't care about service members, who really think service members are immoral, and really think there should be no military and that anybody in the military is a bad person. And I mean, I'm talking about in 2012. So there are people who really still have those feelings. And I don't know where they may come from, but there are people who actually feel that way. So if service members tell you that this is happening, you don't dismiss it. I mean, there are people who are anti-military on a personal level. And this one, even if they do care, they can't understand. This is a strange kind of statement, because on the one hand, it means that that veterans and active duty people really believe that you cannot understand their experiences, and that's why they won't say them. On the other hand, it means if I tell you, you might judge me, so I'm not going to tell you because you won't understand, because you can't understand. When I was at the Vet Center about 3 years, and I've been there about 3 years, I started to say, when I would hear this, I would start to say, I can understand anything you want me to understand. And I said, if you tell me and you want me to know, I'll know it. because I then just started to challenge that because it really isn't true. They can, if the veteran or active duty person opens up to you and explains what they mean, and if you're accustomed to the language of veterans and you understand about values and duty and responsibility, you really can understand what they're saying. Now, you don't have to have a war zone experience to help people talk about trauma if that's going to be the issue. As Dr. Zalaket was saying, though, a lot of times trauma isn't the issue. A lot of times depression is the issue, substance abuse is the issue, marital discord is the issue. All sorts of things can be the issue, just like any other type of client. But again, if you get this statement, just remember that part of it is a pushback. It's a defense. Part of it means I don't want you to judge what I did and make me seem like I'm a bad person. Because the truth of the matter is there are some things that go on in war that are bad things. There are horrible things that go on. But after being at the vet center long enough, I could easily see why, whenever something happened, why it actually did happen. I could also see why service members would feel ashamed about what happened, or feel betrayed. And that's one of the big issues that comes up to this very day, a feeling of betrayal. Yes?
I see that as kind of a sympathy versus empathy thing, because it's like, if I am explaining having a baby to someone who's never had a baby, you can care about that, but you can't understand the feeling unless you've experienced it, kind of thing. So I can understand the frustration and the whole reason behind that statement, and I think that's something to respect them for. Yes, you're right, I'll never understand it, but I'm here to help you.
Yeah, and that's really it, because for most of the time, our job is not to try to help them be better service members. Our job is really to try to help them become better civilians, or reintegrate, or just more healthy people. Yes?
I find that, I'm retired military.
Yes.
And I work at the VA, and I find that it helps me because I do what we call cognitive lending.
Yeah.
Because we're used to having a buddy. So that I find very effective. Because if he's a patrol person, well, I got your back. I'm behind you. We're walking this route together. So I find that's where I find the most powerful connect to the veteran. If you do that cognitive lending, and me, of course, having the combat experience and veteran stuff, I'm able to use that more effectively.
Yeah, and that's perfect, because you've got a built-in rapport that civilians just aren't going to have, and that type of respect that can come from your service is there. So it really does make a big difference. This last one, civilians aren't serious about anything. Well, from a veteran's point of view or a service member's point of view, civilians aren't serious, because civilians aren't driven by the mission. Civilians don't have a very strong devotion to duty. Civilians don't really worry about deadlines and timelines as much as people in the military. Civilians don't, on the other hand, don't worry about getting blown up. They don't worry about getting shot. And so it's a lot easier to just go through life. As the veterans made it very clear to me, if I mess up, somebody dies. And that's something civilians don't ever have to think about. You never have to wonder if your report is late, is someone going to die? Or if I don't get that coffee fixed this morning at 8 o'clock, is someone going to die? That never comes up. But from a military perspective, everything is serious, and most things are life and death, because it's literally life and death. You have to do what you're supposed to do. You have to be responsible. You have to be where you're supposed to be, because if you don't, someone can die. And no one wants to be responsible for someone dying. And oftentimes that winds up being an issue that troubles a veteran. Someone has died and they believe in some way they're responsible. I'm going to go through this part a little quickly. This is about the mission. It means two different things. It's a military operation, and it also describes overall functions and roles. This is one way to look at the mission of the military. Yes.
Dr. Exum,
Mhm.
I'm a West Point family.
Mhm.
My niece is West Point grad,
Mhm.
married a West Point
Mhm.
fellow, and now are in some hole in Louisiana. But prior to that, they were in Fort Bragg.
Yes.
Um, at a social get-together, the sergeant, old-time sergeant, who was the coach of the women's softball team, said to everyone, people think of the military as war people,
Mhm.
but our job is to be a peacekeeper.
Mhm.
And we are devoted to keeping peace throughout the world, which is what you're saying. That struck me, and it totally changed my whole concept of military.
Well, I can understand that because that's how it hit me when I was at the Vet Center. It had never occurred to me that that's how they saw themselves. It had never occurred to me that people joined the military because they wanted to help people. I mean, and so it was a lot like them. If you didn't know who they were and they were just talking about why they did their profession, you could think it was a room full of counselors because of the way they talked about what they do and what's important and how the world should be and what they can do to make a difference. You would not have believed that you were in a room full of combat veterans or people who apply force when necessary. But that's it. It's a very, very different point of view, and that's what makes working with service members complicated, because oftentimes it's not at all what you think. The person's motivation is not what you think. The reason the person is disturbed is not what you think. So listening is even more important than it usually might be, because there's going to be that extra part there that you have to connect with, and that extra part there that they're waiting for you to show that you understand. So it's got to be there. I thought I would just show you these non-negotiable demands of human dignity. These are here now because this is a very big part of what the military sees its role as in other cultures and in other countries. And this whole notion of respect for women, free speech, the one on respect for women and religious tolerance are the two that surprised me the most when they came up. But I could see how the military carries these things out. And the reason I'm saying that respect for women surprised me is because in the past the military had not ever, as in terms of operation, had not seen its role as actually changing cultures. But once you talk about religious tolerance and respect for women, then you're also talking about changing the culture in which you find yourself. Because oftentimes the U.S. military is in a culture that does not have respect for women in the way they're respected here, and does not have religious tolerance in the way that we have it here. So a lot of what the military does do focuses on these issues, and that's also a reason that the military is also resented, because the military does in fact change cultural values wherever it may be. It's there long enough. And the service members there in fact believe that democracy is the best form of government, and they want people to have that everywhere, and there are people who join the military so that can happen. But again, the consequence of that is being hated. Yes.
You're talking about some perceptions within and outside the military.
Yeah.
And the one thing that struck me, and you just started talking about some of the difference for respect for women. I work with about 4 or 5 women who, during their military careers, were all sexually assaulted by fellow military personnel.
Yes.
And when you see the stats that it's not combat, but that sexual assault, #1 cause of PTSD in women, and CNN, MSNBC, there's just so much that's been in the media lately, and we have maybe a certain perception of what's happening as civilians. Can you talk a little bit about what the perception is among military personnel in terms of the amount of sexual violence towards women, how that is perceived differently than civilian society?
The military in general knows that it goes on, and it's something that is not tolerated. The problem is that oftentimes the victims of sexual assault don't come forward, and so then nothing happens, nothing can happen, even when people want it to happen. So the person suffers in silence, and the big issue again goes back to betrayal, because the woman is not only sexually assaulted by but sexually assaulted by a comrade, oftentimes a superior, and so there's the double whammy, of really having the incident plus the betrayal, plus the loss of all the values that you have held on to and you believed in. So it's a very serious issue, and unfortunately, there's also sexual assault is a problem for men and for women. Males are sexually assaulted as well. And gosh, I wish I'd been prepared to talk more about this. I think the most important thing about it's just like Dr. Zuckett was saying in the beginning. Every woman has not been sexually assaulted, but quite a few have been sexually assaulted. And there are some brief screens that you can use and when you're counseling to talk about the issue of sexual assault. And I'll get to those at the end of the presentation. So you should always screen. I think just as just a matter of course, to see if this might be an issue, because we know it does happen. And it happens for all sorts of reasons, and none of which are good. No, but no, the military recognizes it and sees it as a major problem, but it's hard to control it. But again, every woman isn't sexually assaulted, and it's just one of the worst things that can happen to you. Obviously in the war zone, when you're expecting the person to take care of you and not rape you. But no, that's all I can really say. Any other thoughts or comments about that? Yes.
I can tell you, and I'm glad somebody mentioned about, you mentioned not all women are sexually assaulted, and it's not just combat only. We just saw the Air Force Academy. So it's something that's happening during, not just during combat, but also in peacetime. The challenge you have is a culture, and sometimes the female won't say anything because she looks at the how it's going to affect the unit, the team. So you got that kind of thing up. I don't want to say anything because then it'll affect the team. Sometimes you end up finding yourself picking yourself one against the other, because she stands up and says, "This sergeant who may be well liked, respected, whatever, sexual assaulted me." And you end up happening is you have some people who believe her and some people who won't believe her. So you have that kind of the thing that you don't want to have in a military environment. So it's it's a very difficult, and as you mentioned, well, there's also males who clearly won't say anything, they'll keep it to themselves. The trauma was because if they even think about saying something, you can forget it,
Yes.
So the challenge you have, again, is that cohesion that you have, and then if she doesn't come forward, she keeps it suppressed, and then it manifests itself later on. And I'm just telling you the environment why it's so difficult. And why even the leadership may be resistant, because it damages the whole unit. I mean, you may get justice to one person, but you end up fracturing that unit. Just a perspective.
No, and I'm glad you said it that way, because again, that's exactly the point I was talking about with unit cohesion. It's really important not to break the unit. I mean, to really keep it working. And if you believe that you saying something will destroy the unit or damage the unit, then you take it. You don't. You say nothing. Yes.
I'm a former military wife and spent quite a bit of time around the military. And one of the things I think has happened with the military is I think they've had to change their cultural thinking about the way they perceive women. Think about the fact that more women are in the military now, and I think there are still old school military who have a very difficult time accepting women's desire to be in similar roles that they have. And I think that prejudice, along with gays in the military, those two things are a societal, it's happening in society. We've had to change our views, and I think the military has to step up and also accept. And I think there's a real struggle with that.
Yes.
It's an ongoing struggle. I can just remember little things that I would hear some of the fellows talk about, like even just women that are wives. If the military wanted you to have the wife, they would have issued your own. If you've ever heard that concept, so that's kind of a culture. It's a cultural thing in the military, and I think they're struggling with that.
Yes, and you're right. It is a struggle, and their changes are slow coming because again, the people who actually control policy, are from the old guard, and unless the old guard changes how it thinks about things, things really don't change because the military is in fact hierarchical, obviously, and things don't come from the bottom up. They come from the top down. But the good part about the top down, once it is said that it will be so, then it will be so. So it really does make a difference in that sense. This is another quick one. Observation about the mission of the military. I'm running out of time, so I'm not going to try to finish everything. I'll just talk about, I've got 5 minutes, that's why I'll talk for 5 minutes. These are some of the types of common issues that active duty service members may bring to a civilian counselor. And these are also some of the issues that are actually handled within the military itself. But by and large, service members still are reluctant to use counseling services that are available within the military for a number of reasons. Number one is still a fear of a poor performance rating or losing security clearance. There is no guarantee of confidentiality, really. And this one, of course, is major, a fear of appearing weak. No one wants to look like they can't handle it, they can't do their job, that they have a problem, that they're not only physically tough, but they're mentally tough as well. No one wants to look like I can't get my job done or I let the unit down. So all of that's built right in. Those things are very important.